Hello, my name is Professor Jen Snowball, and today's topic is a labour market application about the minimum wage debate. It's applicable to South Africa, but also to lots of other countries that have minimum wages of some kind or another. So before we start, let's just review how the labour market works. So just like any market, there's a demand and a supply side. Labour is demanded by firms. So firms are the ones who advertise the jobs, and then people can apply to work for the firm. So for firms, the wage rate is actually a cost. So the higher the wage rate, the more expensive it is for firms to employ people. But we're actually interested not just in the wage rate, but also in the real wage rate, which is W over P on the slide. W stands for money wage, and P stands for the price level. So you can imagine if you were applying for a job in another country and they told you what the wage rate was in whatever the currency is, you can't tell up front whether that's a high wage rate or a medium one or a crummy one until you know something about the purchasing power of that particular money amount. So that's why you need to know something about the price level as well. So the real wage rate is W, the money wage, divided by the price level, P. And that's what firms concentrate on to determine the cost of employing people. And that's also, as we'll see just now, what households concentrate on when they decide whether to take the job or not. So the first thing that the firms are thinking about is, how much is it going to cost me to employ an extra worker or an extra labour hour? But there's something else that firms also think about, which is how productive are the workers. So we have to pay the person, but how much in terms of goods and services can they actually produce in a working day or a labour hour? So the more productive your workers are, the more of them you would be prepared to hire at a given wage rate. We also know, though, that the marginal product of labour is diminishing. So given a fixed amount of capital equipment and a level of technology, adding more and more workers doesn't necessarily mean that they're all contributing more in each hour. Eventually, there'll be diminishing returns to your labour inputs. So firms hire workers until the marginal product of labour is equal to the real wage rate. What about labour supply? In our model, labour is supplied by households. And this is also determined by the real wage rate, but this time there's a positive relationship. So the higher the real wage rate, the more keen households will be to supply labour. Let's take an example. Imagine that I'm going to employ a research assistant. I want to employ you, and you say to me, okay, I can work for you as a research assistant. How much will you pay me? And I say, okay, 50 Rand an hour. And you can work anywhere between 2 hours and 10 hours per week. So how many hours will you work for me as a research assistant next week? So of course you think about what you have to do, and you also think about your leisure time, and so you make a trade-off between the things that you want to do in your spare time, like going to the movies or spending time with friends, and the amount of money that you can earn. So at 50 Rand an hour, let's say you say, okay, next week I can work for you for 2 hours. So you know that you'll give up 2 hours of leisure time, but you'll take home 100 Rand increase in your income. Now, what if I said to you that we were going to increase the wage rate, so you can still work for me as a research assistant, many hours as you like, but I'm going to pay you 100 Rand an hour. Okay? So now you might think, gosh, well, that means that for every hour of leisure that I give up, I will earn 100 Rand of income. So now the trade-off has become a bit different because leisure, in a sense, is costing me a lot more than it was at 50 Rand per hour. So for households in general, the higher the real wage rate is, the more keen they will be to supply their labour. But they are making that trade-off between income and leisure. Just like for any demand and supply situation, where demand is equal to supply, that gives you labour market equilibrium, which we'll show in a diagram just now. In the classical model, which is what we're using to talk about the labour market, there are some assumptions that we need to be aware of. Firstly, for the classical economists, the economy is usually at full employment. So in other words, they didn't know about long-term structural unemployment, which we have in some countries, and especially in South Africa. So they assumed that there might be fluctuations in employment level, but it wasn't going to be a situation where you would have a long-term disequilibrium of any sort. The second thing was that they assumed that there weren't going to be restrictions that would prevent the real wage rate from going up or down as supply and demand for labor changed. Now, the minimum wage rate is one of the things that would change that assumption, which is why I'm highlighting it here. The other thing that they're assuming is that firms are relatively small, that there's not a huge power differential between workers and owners, and that firms are actually employing labor up to the point where they can no longer afford to do so, right? So the last unit of labor that they employ produces just enough goods and services to cover the real wage rate of that person. Now, when we change some of these assumptions, you'll see that that has an impact on what the real world outcome will be. Let's get on to our topic for today properly, which is the minimum wage debate. Now, in South Africa, minimum wage has been proposed and will come into effect on Workers' Day in 2018. The idea here is that it's a floor price below which you're not allowed to go. So a floor price is the lowest level that you're allowed to go. And in terms of wages, this means that anybody who is full-time employed would not be allowed to earn a salary of less than 3,500 Rand a month. You can certainly pay people more than that, but it's illegal to employ them full-time and to pay them less than that. So, for example, whether you're a farm worker, a domestic worker, a factory worker, working in the tourism industry, if you're a full-time person, then you would earn at least 3,500 Rand per month. Now, if the classical model assumptions hold true, then some economists have argued that this is going to lead to an increase in unemployment because making workers more expensive will have a negative impact on labor demand. You remember that labor demand has got a negative relationship with the real wage rate. So this is firms making a decision about how much labor to employ. At very high wage rates, they employ a lower quantity of labor. They can't afford to employ more than that. And at very low wage rates, they employ more workers. On the supply side, this is households deciding how much labor they can supply, or they're willing to supply, how many hours they're willing to work. And from their point of view, the higher the wage rate is, the more labor hours they're willing to supply in exchange for their leisure time. Where demand is equal to supply, then that's where we have our equilibrium point. So that would be equilibrium. And labor demand and labor supply are in balance. So equilibrium just means this is the point where there's no pressure for the wage rate to rise or to fall. Now, if you have a minimum wage rate, then what that means is that you're basically going to hold the price of labor at some point above the equilibrium level. So there would be your minimum wage rate. Now, you can see that that means that we're not in equilibrium anymore. So over here, this would be the amount of labor that firms would be demanding. So instead of employing the amount that they would at the equilibrium level, they've reduced the amount of labor that they demand, presumably because they can't afford to employ that many people at that wage rate. For households, the opposite happens. So for them, the very high wage rate is a signal that they should provide more labor hours. So labor supply increases, and you can see that they're happy to provide a bigger quantity of labor. Now, the difference between these two represents labor market disequilibrium. So this gap over here, that's where labor demand, as the jobs created by firms, is less than labor supply. And that gives us a surplus labor, or another way of saying that is unemployment. So this is the main problem from, if you believe in the classical model, with the minimum wage rate, that it causes a labor market disequilibrium and might actually increase unemployment. Right, so let's look at the case for minimum wages. Firstly, Stats SA tells us that nearly 57% of South Africans live below the poverty line. Now, what that means is that they have trouble meeting the nutritional requirements for the households, just food. So not taking into account all the other goods and services that households need, but just food. They're having trouble meeting those requirements. So the idea is that by increasing the minimum wage, which will affect mostly those people in the lower paying jobs, you might improve that poverty situation. We also know that in South Africa we have one of the highest levels of income inequality in the world. So if you have a look at the map from the World Bank, you'll see that this shows Gini coefficients, which is a way of measuring income inequality for a whole lot of countries. And you can see that South Africa is one of the darkest colors. So in other words, one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. And the hope is that by increasing the amount of income that goes to the lowest paid part of the population, you would begin to close that gap. There's also a theory that higher wages may increase productivity. So this could happen in two ways. The first way is that workers who are being paid more might be more motivated to do their jobs better. But there's also a theory that the people who employ the workers would then find it more worthwhile to increase their productivity. They could do that, for example, by sending them on training courses or by buying them better equipment. And that would make those workers more productive and therefore move the wage into line again with the marginal product of labour. Given the unequal power relations in some countries, though, and South Africa being one of them in some sectors, there's also the argument that firms are not actually paying where the marginal product of labour is equal to the real wage rate. So in other words, it's not the case that firms are employing people just up to that particular point. They are actually having a bit of slack or a bit of economic profit, and this would be a way of getting the firms to share the profit with the workers. So the idea is that there would be a fall in employment perhaps, but it wouldn't be a very big fall, right? That for most firms, they would simply redistribute some of their profits from the owners, the shareholders, to the workers. What about the case against minimum wages? Well, we've had a look at the diagram to show you what the classical model says, and basically the case against very much rests on that. So there's a concern that especially for small firms who are working really at the point where marginal productive labour is equal to the real wage rate, they will reduce labour demand, right? So they may not fire people straight away, but they may not re-employ contract workers, or when people retire, they may not replace them, or they may reduce the number of days or hours that they employ people for. And this, of course, would not be a good thing as far as the labour market goes, because it would increase unemployment, and South Africa already has a very high unemployment rate. There's also no guarantee that workers in all areas would be able to increase their productivity enough to match the new wage rate. So in some firms or in some industries, that might be a possibility, but in others, maybe it's not. And this might particularly be in those unskilled areas or semi-skilled areas, like domestic work or farm work and some parts of factory work, where people may simply decide to do the work themselves because they have the skills that they need, or to replace the person with some kind of technology or equipment. The rise in unemployment will also reduce economic growth. So if you think back to the way the labour market connects to the production function, then you can imagine that as you reduce the amount of labour input, this could also result in a reduction in real GDP growth, which of course would not be good for South Africa, especially since we're in this kind of low growth path at the moment. What will the effect of the minimum wage be? We have to wait and see. There's been a lot of research that's been done in other countries. It seems to depend very much on what the minimum wage is, so how high it is, how far away from equilibrium is it, and also how it's implemented. So whether there's some way of checking effectively that people are actually being paid the minimum wage and how well that has been put in place.